All right, good morning. I hope I don't make my numbers go down, but if I do, I'm going to blame it on voter fraud. All right, so who's to blame? Do consumers own a piece of food safety? This is the topic Bill and I have been given to debate, and I'm going to start with a very lawyerly statement, which is I want to reframe the question, because I don't like blame. I don't think we're here to talk about blame and food safety. I'd like to say who's responsible. And I think we can agree that everyone is responsible for food safety. And so naturally, the answer to the question, do consumers own a piece of food safety, is yes, of course, right? And that's because industry does not have the capacity to make sterile food. No matter what you do, no matter what interventions are taken, no matter what best practices are adopted, you just can't make all foods safe all the time. Some foods inherently, by their nature, are going to have potential microbial contamination. I mean, consumers want packaged salads. You can't completely 100% eradicate the risk that there might be pathogens. You could irradiate them, but consumers don't want that. Consumers don't even want irradiated meat. So there are options potentially, but consumers have resoundingly rejected those through their pocketbooks, through voting at grocery stores. And even foods that undergo a kill step, that leave a processing facility, a plant, a factory, 100% safe, packed in a can, they can become contaminated, misused, abused in a consumer's home. And through a whole mechanism of reasons that I can't even begin to talk about, all the different ways that there might be storage issues, cross-contamination, failure of cooking, although I am going to talk about that one a little bit. Consumers have a definite responsibility because they are the last defense. They are the ones who have the food and control what happens to it before it is served to themselves and to their families. This is widely recognized. This is nothing controversial, unusual. Foodsafety.gov, you'll see this on a lot of FDA, USDA, CDC websites, reference back to the 4 simple steps to food safety: clean, separate, cook, chill. So we all know consumers have this responsibility. But even before you get there, consumers have a responsibility too for selecting safe food. And there are consumers, the dumpster divers are an example, who will willfully ignore what is out there about safe food. And I think even Bill will tell you he does not eat Sprouts. But beyond that, once the food arrives, assuming consumers are making smart decisions, they get the food in their home. And let's take, for instance, poultry. We know that no matter what poultry processing facilities do, or even before that, at the feed level, at the raising level, you cannot eliminate the presence of Campylobacter on poultry. And as a matter of fact, USDA does not consider poultry with that organism to be adulterated because it's impossible to eliminate it. And every package that consumers buy of poultry will have the USDA required warning on it about cooking it thoroughly, using a meat thermometer, avoiding cross-contamination. So consumers are seeing that. I think it is pretty common knowledge among consumers that you have to be careful when you handle raw poultry. Yet consumers, when they handle it, do not handle it safely. A majority of them do not. So, and I got these statistics from Food Safety News, in case anyone is wondering. 53% of consumers surveyed in 2010, only 53% reported even using a meat thermometer. Slightly more than that, I didn't put the statistic on there, but slightly more than that said they owned a meat thermometer. But it was something around at least 35 to 40% didn't even own a meat thermometer. But even though people report using a meat thermometer, for a lot of people that means, well, that one time a year I make the turkey I get out the meat thermometer. Or the one time I make that big roast, I get out the meat thermometer. Consumers do not use meat thermometers in their everyday practice of cooking. So 46% never use one when cooking poultry, despite seeing that label, that warning from USDA, use a meat thermometer, cook it to a certain internal temperature. 67% never use one when cooking or grilling hamburgers. Only 10% of people, of consumers surveyed, use a meat thermometer on all poultry they cook. So a separate study looked at chicken prepared in homes or on grills in homes and found that 40% is undercooked. And there's a variety of reasons for this, and often, I think you'll probably hear from Bill, that consumer education is the answer. But even when consumers have warnings on packages, and this comes up a lot with frozen foods, especially frozen meat products, they all say uniformly, and I can think of, and I've worked with companies who package foods, where it says at least 14 different ways. That's not an exaggeration. We've counted it up. Raw, uncooked, use a meat thermometer. This is uncooked, this is raw. Front, back, side, inside of wrapper. No matter where you put it, there are some consumers who ignore that. They don't follow preheating. I've been involved in some salmonella outbreaks involving packaged frozen meat products, and Bill has too. And it's amazing when CDC or the local health department goes in afterwards and does the survey following an illness, they'll ask, did you follow the instructions? Well, yeah, I did. Okay, did you preheat the oven? No, didn't do that. Did you use a thermometer? No, I didn't do that. Did you cook in a microwave? Well, yeah, I did. But it says on the package, don't use a microwave. Or check the wattage of your microwave, or ensure that it's thoroughly and evenly cooked. And they don't do that. So, in the end, I think we have to say that everyone has a role. I'm not here to say that industry doesn't have a role. Of course it does. Of course it does. If you're a food company, food safety is your business. But consumers also have a responsibility. And consumers can't expect their food to be sterile and perfect. They have to take the responsibility for keeping their families safe. Thank you.
You guys aren't real consumers. And I stipulate that very few of you would ever be on a jury. So keep those two things in mind. So who are consumers? 37% of voters believe global warming is a hoax. 6% of voters believe Osama bin Laden is still alive. 21% of voters say a UFO crashed in Roswell in 1947 and the US government covered it up. 20% of voters believe there is a link between childhood vaccines and autism. 7% of voters think the moon landing was faked. 29% of voters believe aliens exist. 9% of voters think the government adds fluoride to our water supply for sinister reasons. 14% of voters believe in Bigfoot. 7% of adults, Americans, believe chocolate milk comes from brown cows.
It doesn't.
41% of Americans think that dinosaurs and humans lived on the planet at the same time. And here I'm going to get a little more political. 65% of Republicans think President Obama is a Muslim, and 59% of Republicans think President Obama was not born in the United States. So, who are consumers? I would stipulate with Ms. Brew that with her statistics, consumers need a lot more education in a lot of areas. So, interesting thing is, who are consumers? 62 million scientists and engineers employed in the United States, accounting for 4.8% of the total US population. So I assume that this 4.8% of the population doesn't apply to the statistics that I just laid out or that Sarah just laid out. But there's only 36,100 that are food scientists or in agricultural services. So the people who are educated about food safety are probably mostly at this meeting. So who are consumers? Only 34% of Americans correctly answered that a hamburger is ready to eat when the internal temperature has reached 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Is anybody from New Zealand here today? Nobody's going to admit it. I was in New Zealand just last week, and I was at a conference, and I walked into a buzzsaw. They were just changing their internal cooking temperatures for hamburger to what we started 25 years ago. And you're asking yourself, you know, where was that? But the fact of the matter is most consumers don't know or should know, but they don't know how to cook hamburgers appropriately. 95% of consumers fail to wash their hands long enough to kill harmful bacteria. 18% of Americans think lawyers are useful.
It's a little hot.
Do you think that's fake news? I think so. I think it's like actually 92 think we are useful, so for something, doorstop. But so who are consumers? They're the young, the old, and the immune compromised. So I don't disagree with Ms. Brew that consumers do bear responsibility for what they can be responsible for, but you have to take it into account that it's the young, the old, and the immune compromised that are the most vulnerable. And the fact of the matter is that I always think about it in legal terms. If I decided to go buy raw milk and drink it, and I got O15787, brain damage, kidney failure, lost my large intestines, was stuck in a wheelchair for the rest of my life, people would be sympathetic, but a jury wouldn't give me a penny, right? You put that fact around, and it's a 4-year-old kid who walks across the street and has raw chocolate milk at his friend's house. Same facts. Is it the consumer's fault there? Maybe we could talk about raw milk, but I think you have to put consumer fault in the context of who that consumer is. And if you look at the statistics put out by me or put out by Ms. Brew, the consumer has a long way to go to become educated. Because ultimately, in the legal mind, a jury is 12 consumers. Thank you.
Well, I think, we all have sympathy, Bill, for the 4-year-old child who goes to a neighbor's house. And unbeknownst to his parents, the child has raw milk on cereal at his neighbor's house and becomes seriously ill. But really, I think who's to blame in that situation are the neighbors. And I think in that lawsuit, they did sue the neighbors. Is that right, Bill? Do you remember?
No.
No, they didn't?
No, sued the milk supplier.
Well, okay. I would suggest that it's the neighbors that are at fault, because most consumers who purchase raw milk, I think, are sort of aware of the issues surrounding raw milk, but perhaps not. But again, the question goes back to who is responsible. If I am a food processor and I produce a 100% safe product and it leaves my control, and then something happens with a consumer who doesn't wash his or her hands, who doesn't cook it thoroughly, who somehow creates on their own a risk that did not exist and that I was not, as the food producer, responsible for, why should I be responsible? And it is compelling to a jury to want to point the finger and to find a food company responsible, when the alternative is to look at a mother who failed to properly cook a frozen chicken entree for her child. And jurors know how things work. They know the food company has insurance. And so I think sometimes there are things influencing those jury decisions. But ultimately, the question that Bill and I are here to talk about is, do consumers have responsibility? And they do. And I do think there should be more consumer education. But there are some consumers who, no matter what information they receive, the raw milk purchasers, for example, will decide, will say, I'm an American, I have a right, to choose whatever I want. And if I want to choose something that I think is best, even if it's dangerous, even if it's risky, even if it exposed my children to risk, I have the right to do that. And that's what the raw milk folks say. I will say, how many of you here are old enough that you had home ec in school? Yeah, me too. And there's some statistics, and Bill put some up there about millennials not being as aware of food safety issues. Some people attribute that to the demise of home economics and its counterpart, shop, although that doesn't have to do with food safety. And also to the fact that millennials didn't grow up in a kitchen, cooking meals made from scratch. Now they all want to return back to, create all their own food, whole food, start with the basics. But they sort of lost that generational experience of transferred knowledge about cooking and about food safety. So I think if we want to really look at solutions and not just blame or responsibility, it's really how do we start reinforcing those messages about food safety? It's clear that warnings, labels are not the answer. But I think there's other ways, through schools, through communities, through families, to start talking about food safety. You see public service ads on televisions where they tell parents, talk to your kids about fires, how they get out of the house, about tornadoes, about what happens if someone's poisoned, who do they call? Where are those public service announcements about talk to your children about food safety? That's what I think we should be looking for to help address the issue. Thank you.
So I'm going to get the law thing out of the way. So it's not a zero-sum game in a lawsuit. When you walk into a courtroom, when Sarah and I have been in a courtroom together, there's 100% liability inside of a courtroom. And the issue is how does that liability or fault or responsibility get allocated? And, using myself as an example again, and let's just say it was, I went to a restaurant and got sick, and I ordered a particular food item. Again, most juries probably wouldn't give me a penny, but because I'm supposed to be more knowledgeable about food safety. But if it's a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old kid, the responsibility may shift the other way. So there's always the ability in a legal setting for contributory fault, the dumpster diver. Are they 100% at fault? 98% at fault? Probably. But if it's, if it's a different person in a different fact scenario, the percentage may go the other way. The thing about sort of breaking it down on, consumer fault or consumer responsibility, because I don't really disagree that consumers who do risky things or do stupid things need to be responsible. I get it. I also think we as the food safety community have a lot of responsibility to help educate our population that seems to be, at least if you look at the statistics, a little stupider than we'd expect. But for me, it kind of comes down to part of the reason why I even came to this conference this time. And I think a lot about my friend Dave Thino, and I think a lot about how Dave would ask the question, what would Lauren have me do? He wasn't thinking about fault. He wasn't thinking that, did Lauren's parents ask, was that hamburger cooked to an internal temperature of 155? His question was, how do I protect that 6-year-old kid? And I think in some respects, it's so easy for us to laugh at consumers, laugh at the stupidity of them, laugh that they didn't read the label, laugh at all those things. But the fact of the matter is we all have a responsibility to think like Dave Thino.
very interesting discussion. I guess my question would be, is there actually a food safety advantage, since that's our goal, is preventing foodborne illness, in pushing some of the responsibility to the consumer level? An analogy that I could think of, auto manufacturers were required to put seatbelts into cars in the late 60s. The first laws requiring their use came about in the 80s, at which time it was about a 10% maybe compliance with using seatbelts. Now it's up to about 85%. And most people, I think, would feel odd getting into a car these days without just clicking in their seatbelt. So pushing some of that responsibility down to the consumer level, I think, has improved safety in that case.
Smoking too.
Yeah, same thing. Can we get some food safety advantage here by pushing some of that responsibility down, say, to the family that served the raw milk?
Right. No, I completely agree with you, but I think that one thing I've noticed about, and Sarah can jump in too, one thing I noticed both on seatbelts and smoking, the thing that is been the driver is annoying little children. It was my kids that would be, "Dad, do the seatbelt." Or I remember a friend smuggling back a bunch of Cuban cigars, and I was so excited to smoke them. I'm not a big smoker, but I went to smoke them, and they were all gone because my kids threw them away. So I think that there is really, I completely agree with you, that we pay a lot more attention to our children annoying us than we do with public service announcements. So I do think that might be a really interesting way to sort of push food safety, is have our annoying children in the back seat of the car being more annoying than they already are. So.
And if you look at campaigns about smoking, a lot of that was accomplished through public service announcements, but also education. So again, is there a place in the curricula for health classes to have a component on food safety? You don't have to reinstate home economics. I don't think that would even be politically correct these days, but there's certainly an opportunity in health classes.
Sunny Law, you both are lawyers. So I recently read a case on Google about FESMA violation whistleblower case. So there's a company sells the expired food, expired apple chips. And then his employee on behalf of the consumer protection raised the voice and the rejection, but the employee was fired. So with Sarah, you represent the employer, and Bill, you represent the employee. What would you tell to the jurors? Did the employer have the right to fire the employee and also have the right to sell expired food, given their consciousness and the responsibility? And then what would you say if, Bill, you were to defend the employee on behalf of the consumers?
Yeah, well, first of all, FSMA contains some specific whistleblower provisions within FSMA that allow for certain penalties against employers who fire employees who are reporting food safety issues, and it has some procedural mechanisms that make it easier for employees to bring those complaints. So I think with a lot of cases, you read them on Google or you read them in the news, and there's usually more facts that you need to figure out, and this would be one. There are occasions, consistent with FSMA, where a manufacturer could reprocess or recondition something and make it suitable for sale. So that would be one of the first questions I would ask. The second I would ask is something that was touched on in the first panel, which is, even if it had a technical expiration based on a quality determined best if used by date, was it truly unsafe? Was there truly some kind of FSMA violation? Going back to FSMA, if you look at this company's sort of set of preventive controls, was there a clear violation? So I think there's a lot of questions you would have to answer before you determined what's really going on here.
And the only thing I would add is I've been at this for 25 years, and I think the one thing that I've learned in 25 years is that situations like that are the far off outside of the norm. The PCAs of the world, the knowingly doing things that are, could harm consumers or firing employees for those kinds of reasons are so rare and wonderfully rare. And so I think on average, the food industry, not even on average, but in the far percentages, really do an amazing job of feeding a world population.
Yeah, since FSMA was enacted in 2011, I am not aware of one single successful action based on that whistleblower provision. So you just don't see it.
Barbara Kowalczyk. I think many of you know who I am. If you don't, I am a scientist who lost a child to E. coli 0157 in 2001. I've been working in food safety since then. What many people don't know about me is that I was a scientist well before that happened. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry doing clinical research. I read medical journals, I interviewed pediatricians, I had kids with food allergies, and I religiously read labels. The fact is, we have 48 million illnesses, foodborne illnesses a year in the United States. They are not all from dumpster divers and from people who drink raw milk. They are people like me who were very educated, who thought that they were doing the best they could for their children. My child most likely contracted E. coli 0157 from ground meat. I was not an informed consumer about the risk, but I was highly educated. And I think one of the things that, I have several things I need to comment on, sorry. I'm gonna be on my soapbox. I don't do this too often anymore, but first thing is that I think this was a loaded question to begin with. Yes, everybody has responsibility for food safety. The reality is the consumer, who is armed with a kitchen cleaner and a meat thermometer, has the least amount of control over the safety of their food. If industry, with all of their sanitary procedures and microbiological testing and government monitoring, couldn't control it, please do not think that a consumer can come in and clean up the mess. So yes, consumers have a responsibility, but they have the least amount of control in this process. So I think it was a loaded question to begin with. Secondly, I agree that home ec is something that we need to deal with and bring back into the schools. But I can tell you, my mother-in-law, who did go through home ec, who lost a grandchild to a foodborne illness, refuses to use a meat thermometer, still washes her poultry before she cooks it, despite the fact that I have told her many, many times that this is not safe food practices, and her response is, I've always done it this way. This is how I was taught to prepare my food. It's not just the millennials. We have these older generations who have passed down bad food safety practices to younger generations. So yes, we need home ec. The last point I'm gonna make is that let's look at our 4 key the messages we send consumers. The World Health Organization has 5 keys to safer food. The very first one is use safe foods and raw materials. I have been advocating for I don't know how many years that the US move beyond cook, clean, separate, and chill. If you don't tell consumers that there is a problem and that there's potential risk in the food, then why on earth would anyone think that they're going to use a meat thermometer and follow those 4 safe food practices? And the feedback I have gotten repeatedly is we cannot tell American consumers that there is potential risk in the food. You want to change these numbers? You got to start telling people there's problems. I know I would have made different decisions if I had known the risk I was taking, and I don't eat ground meat. My kids don't eat ground meat, because I'm not willing to take that risk. But I guess it's 2017 now, 16 years ago, I was unaware of that risk, and I let my son eat a hamburger. And for the rest of my life, I will regret that decision. I just wanted to thank you for your time. It was really a comment. I just wanted to clear things up because this is a very important issue, and it's something I'm very passionate about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's really an essential perspective in this discussion.
I think Charles Jim, Ronnie Rochester Midland. I've been in food safety about 38 years of my life. And I've seen many people my age, the changes and the evolution, yet some things haven't changed. There's a balance. I used to be a QA manager also. There's trust and there's responsibility, both by the food producers, the food service, and the retailers, the whole continuum, the farm to fork, even from the farm. And of course, the consumer trusts that that food is safe to a reasonable level, especially if it's prepared food that's cooked. Then you have the consumer where yes, I remember the home ec too, but I think from the education side, it's got to be a two-tier mandatory thing. And not right, because there was a lot of, my mother did things like she said too, you know, I did it this way my whole life, blah, blah, blah. She also nuked in an oven a pot pie till it was burning so hot it would burn your tongue. Now you throw a pot pie in the microwave and it's a little warm in the center, okay, I'm gonna eat it. So, the grammar school level, there's gotta be one level of education to get kids started early age, like with cigarettes and everything else. And then in the high schools, have a hygiene course, that's mandatory. Let the kids, before they start going to college, learn the best practices, the best science, in a basic way, not all gonna be food safety specialists. I think if we don't do that, it's just gonna go in this circle from the consumer side. I think you gotta start now with kids. Get the awareness, get the development, and I think then we can go move forward. We're getting into some of the raw foods, like unfortunately ground beef and whatever. We had a solution for a while that a lot of people didn't want, irradiation. Now there's pro-irradiation people and anti-irradiation people. But irradiation was originally envisioned not that a ground meat or poultry processor could be a dirt bomb facility, but rather to provide that extra layer of security because of the nature of the products. I think that's something that we have to revisit.
But consumers won't buy that.
And that's the problem, because it's been put out there that it's dangerous, you can irradiate radionuclides and all that. People forget to get radionuclides from canned food. So that's the other dynamic. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah and Bill, again, for a very good perspective on the second question. We're going to move on to the third topic this morning. So.